Thanks very much, Jen, for that nice introduction. It probably didn't impress many of you, since I see that many of you weren't born in the 20th century. I was. Okay, so the talk is entitled Fearfully, Wonderfully, Deliberately, the Argument for Intelligent Design from Biochemistry. And you might say, why do we need an argument for intelligent design from biochemistry? Because throughout recorded history, everybody has believed that life, in particular, and the world in general, was intelligently designed. For example, the title, of course, is from Psalms, where David writes, "I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made." Did you ever stop to ask yourself, why did he think that? Why didn't he think he was kind of a blob and nothing special? And we don't know, but probably because he said, "I have fingers, I can grasp things, I can push this plow and wield this sword, I have eyes to see, I have all these neat things. You know, somebody made them for me." And that same idea that we are fearfully and wonderfully made persisted throughout history. For example, another 1,000 years went by, and this fellow here, he's a physician. Oops, see if I get this right. It's dead. It seems to be not functioning. Okay, well, I'll just point with my finger. That guy there. Yeah. All right, I know it's, you need some direction here. That guy there is a guy named Galen, and he was perhaps the best scientist, physician of the classical age. He was a Greek, but he practiced in Rome, and he did anatomy, and he was one of the first folks to dissect animals and trace nerves and the digestive system and all sorts of features of animal bodies, and also human bodies too. And he saw that they were put together, very, wonderfully, that they had many amazing features. And he concluded, as the slide shows, that the human body is the result of a supremely intelligent and powerful divine craftsman, the result of intelligent design. Another 1,500 plus years would go by, and this fellow, an Anglican clergyman named William Paley, put forward perhaps the most compelling argument for intelligent design to date. And he said essentially that if you went out in the field and you tripped on a watch and you picked up the watch and looked at it, you would know it was purposely made. You would know because you'd see the gears and stuff all put together for the purpose of telling time. You wouldn't do the same thing if you just hit your foot against a rock. So everybody thought that the world was purposely, intelligently designed. Until this fellow. And this, of course, is a picture of a young Charles Darwin. And when he was in university, Darwin, like all college students of that time in England, read William Paley's work, and he was very impressed by it. But later on in life, he signed up to be the scientist, the observer upon an English exploring vessel, the HMS Beagle. And the vessel sailed around the world, and in his voyage, Darwin saw many things that he couldn't see in England. For example, in the Galapagos Island, he collected a lot of birds, and a number of them seemed to be new, to not be available anywhere in Europe. And when he brought them back to England, a bird specialist identified them as all as different species of finches. And Darwin thought to himself, why, on the Galapagos Islands, this tiny chain of islands where there's so many finch species, where in South America there was a different species and there was only one. And he kind of scratched his head for a long time. And decades later, he came up with his theory of evolution by natural selection. And in a nutshell, Darwin's Darwin's theory goes something like this, that he saw that individuals of a species can vary. Some are bigger than others, some are faster than others, some are brighter in color. And he said, well, some of those variations might favor the survival. And if they do, then the individuals who survive longer will have a better chance of leaving more offspring. And if those traits can be inherited and the offspring have those advantages as well, then they'll do better in the next generation than the ones who don't have them. And over time, that trait will spread throughout the population. Then maybe another favorable trait will come along, and then maybe another one. And so over long periods of time, maybe great changes could occur in species. And it was a very good idea, but in order to really evaluate it, we have to make some distinctions, which generally aren't made. We have to recognize that Darwin's theory is not just one idea. It has multiple parts, and they are logically independent of each other. And so it's possible for one or more of the parts to be right, one or more of the parts to be wrong. We have to evaluate them separately. And the three main parts that we're going to be interested in here are these. The first is the idea of common descent, that species living today are descended over time from species that lived in the misty past. And in my view, that's an interesting idea. It's an interesting idea about natural history and so on, but ultimately it's trivial, because it doesn't say where the ancestors came from, or how they got their traits, or how the traits were given to new species in our day that might have different properties. So it just says, yeah, we're ancestors and now we've got these things, but it doesn't say how. So it's interesting, but in general, it's not so amazing. Oops, sorry. The second point is the idea of natural selection. And that says that one of those traits might give an edge to the mutant organism that has it, and so they would have a better chance of surviving in their environment. And again, that's an interesting idea. Not many people had thought of that before. But really, it's kind of trivial, because who's going to deny that some feature of biology would favor the survival of an organism or not? Seems pretty straightforward. So those two things are interesting, sure, but not really all that surprising. For my money, whoops, sorry. Whoop. Yes. For my money, the idea of random mutation is the critical claim of Darwin's theory. The idea that utterly random changes in an organism, when culled over time, can build up somehow to give you the amazingly complex systems such as vertebrate eyes. And in that claim, the claim that random mutation over time can provide the fodder for natural selection, there lies 99% of the philosophical and scientific importance of Darwin's theory. So it's right at that point that we're going to concentrate tonight. Now, in order to properly evaluate Darwin's theory, we have to know how life works. Because if a change comes along and it's selected, well, okay, but what caused that change? Turns out that Darwin didn't know, because in his day, the cell, which we now know to be the basis of life, was thought to be simple, just a little glob of jelly, protoplasm. And nobody had any idea how it worked. Molecules, which we know to be the basis of matter, were theoretical entities. Nobody was even sure if they existed or not. So in the 150 plus years since Darwin wrote his book, science has progressed tremendously. And modern science, much to its surprise, has shown that the cell, rather than being a simple glob of jelly, is run literally by machines. Machines made of molecules. This is the cover of a professional biology journal named Cell from about 20 or so years ago. And as you see, it's a review issue dedicated exactly to that topic, to molecular machines. And if you turn the page and look at the table of contents of that journal, you see articles with titles such as "The Cell as a Collection of Protein Machines," "Polymerases and the Replosome, Machines Within Machines," "Mechanical Devices of the Spliceosome, Motors, Clocks, Springs, and Things." So in order to evaluate Darwin's theory, we have to look at the foundation of life. We have to look at how life really works. And that's a little bit of a problem for our time and for the general public, because most people, when you mention the word evolution, think in these terms. You know, on the left, this cartoon, here's a dad fish, and his teenage sunfish is walking away, and the dad says, "Don't walk away when I'm talking to you." And that's how legs developed, you see. That's how legs evolved. And on the right, we see a dinosaur that has feathers, and that's how flight in birds evolved, you see. But of course, the details are, not quite filled in at this level. So in order to really evaluate Darwin's theory, we have to think at the molecular level, at the level of DNA, because modern science has discovered that DNA is chock full of information, literal information to tell the cell how to build those molecular machines, which is represented by this little diagram here. This is supposed to be a molecular machine walking along something called a microtubule, which is a highway made out of molecules that tells it where to go and when to turn and so on. So in this lecture, we're going to concentrate also at the foundational level of life. And I think the purpose of the talk is to show you why we should think that life was purposely designed. Not why we can if we strain real hard, not why we can be permitted in a free society to think, but why we should think that the strong evidence demands that we think that life was purposely designed. And the structure of my talk from here on is going to be similar to a little op-ed I wrote about 15 years or so ago for the New York Times when there was a teaching controversy in Kansas about evolution, and they wanted somebody to explain intelligent design to their readership. It wasn't actually on the front page, but with Photoshop you can do wonders these days. And the structure of the argument is this. It just has 5 simple points. The first is that design is not some mystical idea. You don't have to close your eyes and wave your hands to conclude something was designed. Rather, it's deduced from the physical structure of a system. The physical structure. The second point is that everyone agrees that aspects of biology appear to be designed. And when I say everyone, I mean even those folks who most strongly say that they don't think the design is real, they just think it's a misleading appearance. Nonetheless, everyone agrees on that. And the ones who think that the appearance of design is misleading think there's another explanation, and that is a Darwinian mechanism, a Darwinian process. So the third point of the argument is to show you that there are structural obstacles to Darwinian evolution. There are physical reasons to think that it cannot do what its proponents claim for it. But you say that, well, every time I read an article about evolution in a magazine or see a TV show about it, I'm told that science has already shown that Darwin's mechanism explains all of life. And so the fourth point is to show you that those grand Darwinian claims rest on undisciplined imagination. And by undisciplined imagination, I mean imagination is good, but when it strays too far from the facts, it can get you into trouble. And the fifth point is a summary point. The bottom line is that right now, in the year 2019, we have extremely strong evidence for design, but virtually no evidence that Darwin's mechanism can do what is claimed for it. So let's try to go through each one of those in turn, starting with that first and most important one, that design is not some mystical idea, it's deduced from the physical structure of a system. But first we have to ask ourselves, what do we mean by intelligent design? Well, if you look in a dictionary, you'll see a bunch of definitions, but the relevant one is this. Design is the purposeful or inventive arrangement of parts or details. And just to simplify a tiny bit, we'll say that design is the purposeful arrangement of parts. And that means that we infer design, we decide that design has occurred whenever parts appear to have been arranged for a purpose. Now that's a bunch of words. Why don't we look at an example on the next slide here. Now, this is a Far Side cartoon, and here we've got a troop of explorers, and the lead explorer has been strung up and skewered. And this guy here turns to this guy here and says, "That's why I never walk in front." Words to live by, let me assure you. Okay, now everybody in this auditorium looks at this cartoon and you immediately realize that this was designed. That was no accident. As a matter of fact, the humor of the cartoon depends upon you recognizing that it's designed. It wouldn't be all that funny if he just kind of fell over a cliff. How do you know that? How do you know it was designed? You know it's designed because you see a number of parts arranged for a purpose. You see the purposeful arrangement of parts. It turns out, when you think about it a little bit, that a purposeful arrangement of parts is the way, the only way that we recognize the work of a mind. Here, of course, is Rodin's famous sculpture, The Thinker, and what would it have to do to convince you it was intelligent? If it stood up and fell over, maybe if it stood up and arranged a couple of pieces into a jungle trap, you would know it was intelligent. There's two other things we have to know about design so that we don't get confused easily. The second is that the strength of the inference to design is quantitative. And by that I mean that the more and more parts you have, and the more and more closely they fit their purpose, the more and more and more and more confident you can be in the conclusion of design. Here's an example of that. Suppose you and a buddy were out hiking and you passed by these mountains, and he asked you where they came from. And you might say, I never took a geology course. Earthquakes, plate tectonics. Maybe probably most people would be satisfied by that. But suppose you and your friend continued your hike. You were very fit, and you went to this mountain, the Old Man of the Mountain in New Hampshire, and he asked you that same question. He said, where do you think that mountain came from? And you say, hey, this kind of looks like a chin here. And this might be the mouth and a nose and a forehead. Do you think that may be some prehistoric tribe? Nah, probably just a coincidence. You know, you look at it from another angle, it doesn't look like anything. But suppose you and your friend continued your hike and you came across these mountains. And he asked you that same question. You know, where do you think these mountains came from? And even if you had never heard of Mount Rushmore, immediately everybody would recognize that this portion of the mountain was purposely designed. And you would recognize it because you see a number of parts in the shape of the rocks purposely arranged to portray the figures of these four presidents. So that's the point, that the inference to design is quantitative. You can have no evidence for design. You can have a little bit of evidence, and you can have overwhelming evidence. One last point is that design can be found at multiple independent levels. That is, something might be designed, and that might be used in the design of something else, and altogether they might be used in the design of something else. And the easiest example of this is with writing. You start with a word, and you can combine the word into a phrase, and then into a sentence, and then into a text, and you can make an encyclopedia, or you can make lots of other things with it. Each level of design depends on the previous level, but the previous level can't predict what the next level of design is going to be. And if, just to drive the point home, we'd recognize the letter S. You know, it kind of looks designed. We've heard about it. And when we see it in a word, we recognize that this is not an accidental arrangement of letters. And if it's a longer word with more parts to it, then we recognize it more easily. And then we can use that word in lots of phrases, summer vacation, summer whatever. And we can use that in further sentences, and we can go on from there to make any sorts of designed writings. And you can see it in physical objects too. If you go to a lumber yard, everybody would realize that these were not sticks gotten out of the forest. This lumber was cut and shaped, and these concrete blocks were shaped for a purpose. And when we see something under construction, we realize that these things are being arranged for another purpose beyond what these had, and that a completed house or warehouse or something else, mansion, is a higher level of design. Okay, so that's the first and most important point, that design is a common conclusion. Don't let anybody tell you that it's some religious or philosophical conclusion. It's something we conclude every day from the physical structure of a system. So let's go on to the second point, that everyone agrees that aspects of biology appear to be designed, even people who most strongly think that that's misleading. And since we can't see what everyone has said, we'll instead substitute Richard Dawkins, who in 1986 wrote a classical book defending Darwin's theory called The Blind Watchmaker. And on the very first page of the first chapter of his book defending Darwin, he wrote the following: "Biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose." That's the very definition of biology, according to Richard Dawkins. Well, does he think that that biology looks to be designed? Why does he think that? You know, he doesn't think it's true. Why does he even think it looks to be designed? Kind of counterintuitive. Is it because maybe for aesthetic reasons? Maybe he thinks, you know, flowers are pretty and baby seals are cute, and so it just seems like somebody must have made them that way? Well, no, according to Richard Dawkins, he doesn't think they look designed because of aesthetic reasons. He thinks they look designed because of engineering reasons. He writes that any engineer can recognize an object that has been designed, even poorly designed, for a purpose, and he can usually work out what that purpose is just by looking at the structure of the object. What does he mean by that? He means we recognize it in the purposeful arrangement of parts. So even Richard Dawkins agrees that that's how we recognize design. I'm going to skip because of the pressures of time. So let's go talk briefly about structural obstacles to Darwinian evolution. That was the main topic of my book in 1996, Darwin's Black Box. And it's a problem that Darwin himself recognized. He wrote in The Origin of Species, right after talking about the vertebrate eye, he said that if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not have possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down, but I can find out no such case. Here Darwin was insisting that his theory of evolution had to be gradual. Evolution had to occur slowly, in tiny steps, over long periods of time, because he knew that if complex things arose rapidly in great leaps, it would look strongly as if something other than random processes were involved. So Darwin always insisted on this. Well, what kind of a organ or system or machine could not be made by numerous successive slight modifications? And one which can't is one which is called irreducibly complex, or has the property of irreducible complexity. And in the book, I pointed out a mousetrap as an example from our everyday life of that concept, that a mousetrap has a number of different parts. It's got a spring, a metal hammer, holding bar, wooden platform, and so on. And all those parts are needed for it to work. If you take one away, it's not like it's working half as well as it used to, or a quarter as well as it used to. It's broken. It doesn't work at all. Now try to think, how can you make something like a mousetrap by something like a Darwinian process, by numerous successive slight modifications, each one working and each one likely to occur randomly? You know, could you start, say, with just the wooden platform and, you know, hope to catch mice inefficiently? Well, maybe they ran over it, they might trip and hurt themselves. And then maybe you could add a piece to it. Maybe this holding bar here, and maybe when it tripped, it would impale itself on the holding bar, and that would help. Now, of course, that's silly. The problem with irreducibly complex systems is that they pretty much only work when you got the whole thing. And it turns out that at the molecular level of life, irreducible complexity is pretty much the rule. Recall that the molecular machines dominate the molecular level of life and the cell, and that the mousetrap is a simple machine. Well, if a simple machine is a big problem for Darwin's theory, more complex ones will be too. And here's a drawing of a complex molecular machine called the bacterial flagellum, which is literally an outboard motor that bacteria use to swim. It's got many parts. It's got this long filament that acts as a propeller. It's got a hook that attaches it to the drive shaft. It's got the motor, which uses a flow of acid to turn, and many other parts. And like the mousetrap, if you take one or more of these parts away, the flagellum can't spin. So trying to imagine how something like this would be put together by Darwin's theory is orders of magnitude worse than a mousetrap. Now, let's see, what's my next slide here? Okay, well, I'm going to have to skip over a couple because of time, but I just want to point out that irreducible complexity has a double use. Because it needs all of its parts for its function, it can't be put together in the numerous successive slight way that Darwin always insisted. And what's more, it is an example of a purposeful arrangement of parts. It's putting many parts together in order to perform a function, whether it's catching a mouse or allowing a bacterium to swim through liquid. And again, I don't have time, but since the 20 years or so since the book has come out, things have only gotten much, much worse for Darwin. Here's an example of, I don't have time to explain, but this is a supercharged flagellum found in a bacterium off the coast of Japan. Each one of these yellow wheels is a cross-section through a flagellum such as we saw on the last slide, and each one of these green things is a counter-rotating gear to allow all of these things to spin in the same direction without bumping up and stopping each other. Here's another example. This is something called a bacteriophage, which is like a virus that eats bacteria. This is bacteriophage T4, and here's a drawing of it. Looks like a lunar lander or something. And DNA is up here, and it has to send the DNA of the virus into the bacterial cell. And only a few years ago, people using new methods were able to, well, let me go back there, were able to look in detail at this little section right here, which is called the base plate. And this is the structure of the virus base plate region before it attaches to a bacterium, and this is it after it's attached. This whole thing is an automated mechanical syringe which this is the needle part which pushes down through the membrane of the bacterium, and the DNA is injected down here. Notice that all these parts, and each one of these little tiny dots is a very complex protein in its own right. Each of these parts exists for the purpose of injecting the DNA. So it's a purposeful arrangement of parts. And let me just skip ahead a little bit. Oh, these are funny. I'm just letting nature speak for itself instead of telling you all my jokes. A few years ago, using new microscopic techniques, some English biologists looked at the legs of this little bug called the plant hopper. And apparently it's pretty common. And they noticed there were bumps. The bumps on the top of its legs had been seen in the 1950s, but nobody knows what they were doing. You know, I have bumps on my nose. They don't have any, particular purpose. But then these biologists were able to look closer because of advances in microscopy. And they saw that they were gears, real mechanical gears. And gears, of course, are pretty much the paradigm of a purposeful arrangement of parts. If they aren't oriented correctly, if there aren't enough teeth, if there aren't much of anything, they don't work. So the point is that the more and more science progresses, the more and more and more and more purposeful arrangements, overwhelmingly purposeful arrangement of parts. Okay, so what kind of reasoning is this? Let's ask ourselves, make sure we understand how we're thinking here. What kind of a reasoning is it if said whenever we see a purposeful arrangement of parts in our everyday life, we always realize that it was designed? Now, surprisingly, unexpectedly, science has discovered astonishing purposeful arrangements in life. And since we realize from our everyday experience that points to design, we are justified, rationally justified, in thinking that these too were designed. What kind of an argument is that? Well, here's a colloquial, everyday example of that kind of reasoning here. What is that? Okay. Yeah, it's a duck. And how do you know that? Because, yeah, if it looks like a duck, and if it walks like a duck, and if it quacks like a duck, we are justified in concluding that is a duck. And of course, that's an everyday example, and it seems silly, but philosophers know that that's just one of two basic modes of reasoning, and they even have a technical term for it. They call it inductive reasoning, you see. Honest, hey, I didn't make up that name, hey. You might say, oh, inductive reasoning, philosophers, so is this a philosophical argument? Well, no. It turns out if you look up the term inductive reasoning in some reference book, like, say, the Encyclopedia Britannica, you'll see something like this. Inductive reasoning. When a person uses a number of established facts to draw a general conclusion, he uses inductive reasoning. This is the kind of logic normally used in the sciences. The argument for intelligent design is a scientific argument. It relies on physical evidence and normal logic that whenever we see a purposeful arrangement of parts, we conclude design. So that was the last point, and those other ones were real good too, but we'll have to skip those. And so I think that if you think about this argument, if you think about all of the points, and you start to wrap your mind around it, that you will conclude that the idea of intelligent design is rationally compelling. Now, in ending, I should say that I do have some critics on this argument, and not everybody agrees with me. There's one or two who haven't signed on yet. So if you want to find how I've responded some of the criticism, it can be found on my faculty webpage at Lehigh, at the webpage of the Discovery Institute, and for the more recent stuff on the website of my new book, Darwin Devolves. And if you, those will give you my replies. If you want to track down the original critical writings themselves, they're easy to find. Just, type my name into any web browser, plus any common swear word, and you'll You'll get lots of hits. So thanks very much for your attention.